Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is our ongoing series digging into the manual of patent examining procedure section by section.
Yep, trying to make sense of U.S. patent law and procedure by looking closely at the MPP itself.
And today we're heading into Chapter 1200, Appeals.
Specifically, MPP Section 1215. The title is Withdrawal or Dismissal of Appeal.
Right, so this is all about what happens if you start an appeal with the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, but it ends before they actually make a decision.
Exactly. Section 1215 spells out the rules, the procedures, and really the consequences when an appeal stops early, whether, you decide to stop it or the office does.
And we're pulling this info straight from the MPP, trying to give you the practical breakdown.
Just a quick thank you first to Mike Shepard. He's the creative director who put this whole audio series together for us.
Absolutely. And the necessary disclaimer here.
Right. This summary was generated using AI tools like ChatGPT and Notebook LM, so it might have errors or omissions.
It's really just for general educational and informational purposes. It's definitely not legal advice, not a substitute for formal instruction.
For the real deal, the authoritative guidance, you always need to consult the official MPEP, or talk to a qualified instructor, or, of course, a registered patent practitioner.
Okay, so let's dive in. Picture this. You got a final rejection,
Yeah.
You filed your notice of appeal, you're officially on the path to the PTAB,
Mm-hmm.
but things don't always go as planned. Maybe you change your mind, maybe a deadline slips by. How does this appeal journey end early?
Well, the MPP starts with voluntary withdrawal. This is where you, the applicant, actively choose to stop the appeal before the PTAB actually rules on it.
Okay, so you're in the driver's seat. You can just say, stop. But I'm guessing it's not always that simple. There must be consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Big ones. Especially depending on timing and the status of your claims. The MPP is really clear. If you voluntarily withdraw after your deadline to respond to the final rejection is passed, and you have 0 allowed claims left in the application, withdrawing the appeal means the application is considered abandoned right then and there, as of the date you file the withdrawal.
Wow. So if all your claims are rejected, time's up on responding to the final, and then you withdraw the appeal. That's it.
Yeah.
Application gone. That's critical.
It really, really is. You've got to know where you stand with claims and deadlines. But there's a flip side. MPEP 1215.02 clarifies this.
Okay.
If you do have some allowed claims in the application, voluntarily withdrawing only pulls the rejected claims off the appeal. It does not automatically abandon the whole application.
Okay. So if there's something allowed, something salvageable, withdrawing the appeal doesn't kill the entire thing. That's a huge difference.
Massive difference. You can keep going with those allowed claims. Now, another really common way to voluntarily withdraw an appeal is by filing an RCE.
Right. The request for continued examination. Get back in front of the examiner, maybe try again there instead of going all the way to the board.
Exactly. And filing a proper RCE, that's under 37 CFR 1.114, is automatically treated as withdrawing the appeal.
Okay. Proper being the key word there.
Definitely key. The MPP stresses that this RCE only counts as a withdrawal if it's complete. That means paying the fee and including a proper submission. Like an amendment or maybe an IDS.
So you can't just file a piece of paper saying RCE and think you're good. It has to be the whole package, fully compliant.
Correct. If you file an incomplete RCE, it might not withdraw the appeal effectively. And depending on where you are in the timeline, that could still lead to problems, maybe even abandonment if you're not careful. The procedures are strict.
Makes sense. Any other simple ways to voluntarily back out?
Yeah, there's another one mentioned in 12.02. You can simply amend the application to cancel all the claims that were under appeal.
Oh, right. If the claims you were appealing are just gone,
Yeah,
then there's nothing left to appeal for those claims.
exactly. The appeal is considered withdrawn for those specific claims you canceled. Simple as that.
Okay. So that's withdrawing everything you appealed. What if you only want to pull some claims out, like a partial withdrawal?
Yeah, MPP 1215.03 covers that too. You can do a partial withdrawal, usually by filing an amendment that just cancels certain appealed claims, but leaves others still on appeal.
All right, trimming down the issues going to the board.
Precisely. Now, 1215.03 also brings up a really interesting situation that can lead to a kind of partial involuntary dismissal. This one gets triggered by the examiner.
How so?
It happens if the examiner, in their official answer to your appeal brief, introduces a new ground of rejection.
So you made your case in the brief, the examiner responds, and suddenly there's a whole new reason presented why your claim shouldn't be allowed, something that wasn't in the final rejection.
Exactly that. And when that happens, the MPP puts a specific clock on you. You have 2 months from the mailing date of that examiner's answer.
2 months to do what?
You have to respond, either by filing a reply brief specifically addressing the new ground, or by filing a compliant reply under 37 CFR 1.111, which is the general rule for responding to examiner actions.
Okay, 2 months to push back on that new rejection. What if you don't? If you miss the deadline or just don't respond properly?
Then, the MPP says the appeal will be dismissed sua sponte.
Sua sponte, meaning the office just does it on its own. You don't get a warning. It just happens.
Pretty much, yeah,
Oh.
on their own initiative. But here's the really important part. The dismissal is only for those specific claims that were hit with that new ground of rejection you didn't respond to.
Oh, that's a key point. It doesn't automatically kill the entire appeal.
No, not necessarily. If you had other claims on appeal that weren't affected by that new ground, the appeal can continue for those.
So failing to respond to a new ground is bad for those claims, but might not sink the whole ship.
Right. And this same 2-month response requirement and potential partial dismissal applies if you get a substitute examiner's answer with a new ground, or if the board had previously sent the case back to the examiner, a remand, and a new ground comes up then too.
Got it. So always watch out for those examiner's answers and any new grounds. Now, besides that situation, what are the other ways the office might just dismiss your appeal entirely, involuntarily? MPP 11215.04, right?
Right. 1215.04 lays out 4 main reasons for involuntary dismissal.
Okay, what are the big ones? The main procedural traps.
Number 1, probably the most straightforward, is failing to file your appeal brief on time.
The main document arguing your case to the board.
Exactly. You file the notice of appeal, and then Rule 41.37 gives you 2 months from that filing date to get the actual brief submitted. If you miss that 2-month deadline, the appeal is just automatically dismissed. End of story for the appeal itself.
Just like that. No second chances.
Not for the appeal staying alive at that point. And here's that critical consequence popping up again. If the appeal is dismissed for failure to file the brief, and you have no allowed claims left,
Then the application is abandoned.
the application's abandoned. The MPP even gives an example. Claims 1, 2, and 3 are all rejected. You appeal, you don't file the brief, application abandoned.
Wow. Okay, deadline for the brief is absolutely critical, especially if you don't have any allowed claims as a safety net. What's reason number 2 for dismissal?
Filing a brief that doesn't comply with the rules. 37 CFR 41.37 has a whole list of requirements for what needs to be in the brief and how it should be formatted.
Right.
If you file something, but it's deficient, the Patent Appeal Center, they're the ones who check these things, will usually send you a notice of noncompliance.
Okay, so they tell you what's wrong.
Yes, and they give you a deadline to fix it. You have to file a corrected brief addressing all the problems they identified by that deadline. If you fail to respond properly and on time, dismissal.
So getting it filed isn't enough. It has to be correctly filed or fixed fast if they flag issues.
Exactly. Now, the MEP does note you might be able to petition to get the appeal reinstated in this situation, but, it's much better to just file a compliant brief in the first place or fix it promptly.
Makes sense. What's the third reason?
Money. Specifically, not paying the appeal forwarding fee. There's a fee under 37 CFR 41.2b4 that's required to actually send the appeal from the examiner up to the board.
Ah, the forwarding fee. When is that due?
Typically, it's due at the same time as the appeal brief. If you don't pay that fee on time, even if you filed a perfect brief, the appeal gets dismissed.
Another administrative trap. Miss the fee, lose the appeal. Ouch.
It happens. Procedural details matter. And the fourth reason brings us back to something we touched on earlier.
Let me guess. Failure to respond to new grounds.
You got it. Failure to timely respond to new grounds of rejection raised in an examiner's answer or a substitute answer. Again, if you don't file that reply brief or compliant response within the 2-month window, the board may dismiss the appeal, specifically as to those claims affected by the new grounds.
It's interesting how that one issue, not dealing with new rejections, can lead to both a partial dismissal or potentially factor into a full dismissal depending on the context, really highlights its importance.
It really does. And, underlying all these scenarios, withdrawal, dismissal, partial, full, is the impact on the actual claims. The MPEP gives examiners guidance on how to treat claims based on whether they were allowed, rejected, or just objected to when the appeal terminates.
Right, because it's not always straightforward, especially with claims that depend on other claims.
Exactly. There's a classic example the MPP uses involving dependent claims. Let's say Claim 1 is rejected and you appeal that rejection. Claim 2 depends on Claim 1, but Claim 2 itself wasn't rejected on its own merits. It was just objected to because its base claim, Claim 1, was rejected.
Okay, so Claim 2's only problem is Claim 1's rejection.
Right. Now, if the appeal covering Claim 1 gets withdrawn or dismissed for any of these reasons we've talked about, what happens to Claim 2?
I assume it gets canceled along with Claim 1.
Typically, yes. Both Claim 1 and Claim 2 will be canceled by the examiner during cleanup after the appeal ends.
Even though Claim 2 wasn't technically rejected itself.
Correct. Unless you took action before the appeal terminated. If you had filed an amendment to rewrite Claim 2, maybe make it independent or depend on an allowed claim, then it might survive.
So you have to proactively fix that dependency issue if you want the dependent claim to live on after the base claim's appeal fails.
Precisely. It shows that ripple effect. The fate of one claim can directly pull others down with it unless you manage those dependencies properly through amendment.
Wow. That really drives home how these procedural rules aren't just abstract concepts. They have very real, very practical effects on the scope of protection you might end up with or will lose entirely.
Absolutely. Understanding this stuff is critical.
So let's bring it back to you, the listener. You're trying to navigate the patent system. Why is drilling down into these details of MPEP 1215 withdrawal and dismissal so important?
Well, because knowing these rules helps you avoid potentially catastrophic mistakes, honestly. Understanding what triggers an involuntary dismissal, like missing that 2-month brief deadline we mentioned under 41.37.
Or forgetting to pay the forwarding fee under 41.20d4.
Exactly. These aren't just small procedural hiccups. They can directly lead to your appeal being dismissed and potentially your entire application being abandoned if you don't have allowed claims. That's about as high stakes as it gets in prosecution.
And on the flip side, knowing the exact consequences of voluntarily withdrawing is just as vital, especially that rule about automatic abandonment. If you withdraw after the final rejection response period with no allowed claims, that knowledge directly informs whether withdrawal is even a viable strategy sometimes.
Right. It forces you to weigh the options carefully. And then there's the strategic angle, understanding how partial withdrawals work or how filing that compliant RCE gets you off the appeal track and back to the examiner. That gives you flexibility. It lets you make informed decisions about, which battles are worth fighting on appeal versus which might be better handled differently. It's about managing the process effectively.
It definitely sounds like these rules are the guardrails. You need to know where they are so you don't accidentally go off the track.
That's a great way to put it. They define the path forward and the consequences for stepping off it.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap. We've walked through MPEP 1215, looking at how appeals can end before a PTAB decision.
Right, covering voluntary withdrawal things like filing an RCE, canceling claims, or just explicitly withdrawing.
And the consequences, especially abandonment risks.
Yep, and then involuntary dismissal, the big four being failure to file the brief, filing non-compliant brief, not paying the forwarding fee, and crucially, failing to respond to new grounds of rejection raised by the examiner.
We also touched on how the status of claims allowed, rejected, objected to, dependent dictates what happens when an appeal ends.
I think the main takeaway here is just how critical procedural compliance is in the appeal process described in 1215. Deadlines are everything, especially those 2-month windows for the brief and for responding to new grounds.
And you absolutely have to know the status of your claims, especially, are any allowed, because that often determines the ultimate fate of the application if the appeal terminates early.
It really does. Attention to detail is key.
Definitely. So building on all that, here's a final thought for you to consider. Knowing how strict these rules are in MP 1215 and how easily an appeal can be dismissed or withdrawn with potentially severe consequences, how might that knowledge influence your strategy much earlier in the process? Like when you're first drafting your claims or deciding how to respond to the first office action, does thinking about these potential appeal pitfalls change how you approach the very beginning of prosecution?
Definitely something worth mulling over, how the end game might shape the opening moves.
Indeed. And we'll close with our standard disclaimer one last time.
This summary came from AI tools, might have errors, and is purely for educational info. It's not legal advice.
Always consult the official MPEP, a qualified instructor, or a registered patent practitioner for authoritative guidance.
And a final thank you to Mike Shepard, our creative director for the series.